Before we begin this program here, we're going to be doing a traveling exhibit and a series of other events related to the Native veteran experience coming up in the spring. And so as Dr. Julie Pearson Little Thunder from our Oklahoma Oral History Research Project to come up and talk with us a little bit about some of the programming and the events that we'll be having in conjunction with that. So, and then when Dr. Ward comes there, we'll get her set up and get right started with her talk then. So, Julie?
Hi, everybody. Really glad to see you here today. I wanted to tell you just a little bit about the partnership that we have going with the Shalako Alumni Association. I think it was about 1.5 years ago that they came and talked with us about some goals that they had, and we've sort of been working together since to both interview Native veterans, but also Shalako alumni, to help with the scanning of archival material related to Chilocco Indian Agricultural School. And we have subcontracted with a film company, Fire Thief, to do a documentary on Shalako. And in fact, they were filming up there, I think today, doing some filming on campus. So it's been just a really rewarding experience so far, and we have Mr. Pino, who will talk to you a little bit more about the Shalako Alumni Association and some of their work. But I did want to let you know about the spring when we will be hosting an exhibit that actually arose. It's the National Museum of the American Indian, when they were when they were doing their research on the Native Veterans Memorial and wanting to bring the role that Native veterans have played to the forefront of public consciousness. They also came up with this idea for a traveling exhibition. There are actually, I think, two exhibitions that travel concurrently, and it's called Patriot Nations, and Shalako occupies a prominent role within that exhibit. So we have the exhibition, we know, sometime between February and March. We don't have an exact date yet, but we're very excited to be able to be one of the hosts for the exhibition. It's currently at the Potawatomi Cultural Center right now. We'll be traveling around Oklahoma and some other places, but we'll be having a special speaker during that period, and that will be Dr. Jim Baker, who is a member of the Shalako Veterans Association and the Alumni Association. He'll speak a little bit about Shalako's military history, but it's unique among boarding schools in having had that the presence of the National Guard there on the Shalako campus, and just an extraordinary kind of service record on the part of its alumni. Mr. Pino, would you like to come up and say a few words about you guys' work?
I came here to listen. I didn't come here to talk. My name is William Pino. I am married to Betty, formerly Betty Steele, who graduated from OSU, summa cum laude. And I graduated from the University of New Mexico. I'm a full-blood Laguna Pueblo Indian. Not very many of us full-bloods left. I think Poncas have about one more full-blood still living, alive, and well. Shalako has kind of gotten dear to my heart because Betty went to school there. And because she went to school there, she is a member of the Shalako National Alumni Association. She has been the publicity officer for the last 4 years. Yeah, okay, I made a mistake. Anyway, she's publicity officer for the Shalako National Alumni Association. I am also a member of the board. I am a member at large. Shalako Indian School was commenced in 1884 and closed in 1980. In 1982, Congress passed a law to establish Shalako. And there was a group of men who came to Oklahoma to see where it might be located. They first thought it might be located where Ponca City is now located. Then they searched around more, and they went up towards Kansas, and they decided the plains there was an exact location that they were looking for to accommodate the school as well as the purpose. It was primarily an agricultural school, so they wanted all that nice land. Ever since the school started, the Alumni Association has met annually. So we are at about 82? Somewhere in that area of reunions. And it's not just one class, but it's the whole school that meets annually. And we have been meeting for the last 4 years at the First Council. And the First Council Event Center has been very, very good to us about providing us a place to have our reunion. The Chilocco National Alumni Association is comprised of members throughout the United States. We have some coming to us from Alaska, Florida, and every point in between. And we've met there. And it's really interesting to watch the alumni get together and just talk about old times, crying, laughing, and just enjoying themselves. We do have each year the registration, then we have the banquet, then we recognize the alumni, a breakfast in the morning, and at lunch, then we have the banquet, and then we can go on campus, and the individuals like to go through the rooms that are still available. There was one lady who went into the Home 5, and she was privileged to go to the room where she lived for about 4 years. We have been working, as Julie has said, with Sarah and Julie and, please tell me, I forgot your, David, on the vet project. And I want to tell you, these three individuals are excellent individuals who have taken us under their wing, and they have captured our desire to honor the veterans from Shalako, from the very beginning up to current time. You know, since the school closed, our membership keeps dwindling. And last year, in my wife's annual report to the national members, we had 100, how many deaths? 87 deaths. And that's about where it is each year. So it is getting very difficult for all the alumni to function as responsible officers, so they have invited us associates to take care of some of the work that they would normally perform. As Julie said, the media center is right up, the media people are up in Shalako campus, and that's where we were this morning. We grabbed all the memorabilia that Jim Baker had in his trailer. We unloaded them so that they could go through it, photograph, scan, and there's one boy there, I forget his name. He said his father went to school in Shalako, and he was excited to be on campus. So we have encouraged him, in fact, twisted his arm to become an associate. We won him big time. And Sarah and Julia have, from the very beginning, have so involved themselves so that I think the veterans of the Shalako School are going to be honored and well documented. And I publicly thank you in behalf of the Shalako National Alumni Association. Right now, yes, another, and Mr. Peters also, but he came in a little bit late. because not late into the room, but late into the program, because he came in at the time we needed him to scan. And he had a crew there last year at a reunion. They had a whole table with scanning machines, and he was running that thing through like he was really moving. And we thank you so much. Right now, the Alumni and Associates are at Arkansas City, and we're participating in the Arkansas City Arkalala festivals. We have a booth there with Indian tacos, the blue and red dessert, which is a fry bread with strawberries and whipped cream on top. It's a dessert. It's really good. Then we have the Indian taco. The fry bread is about this big with beans, onions, tomatoes, lettuce, and if you want some hot jalapeno, hey, you're invited to come up and partake. We also have our fire truck in the parade. We had the fire truck last night in the parade with lights on it, and it was the oldest fire truck. A little story about the fire truck. When it was brought down from Pennsylvania, two of the staff went up there to get it, and they drove it back. And when they were coming back, this one man who was driving happened to push a button that caused the sirens to go off, and he got so excited he put on the brakes and pulled off to the side. He thought he was getting pulled over by the state patrol, but they got back here all right, and it's still running. There was a man who took it over, Charles Leclerc. He worked on it for 5 years to get it running. And just last year when we were going to get it in the parade, we had too many passengers in the cab under the front seat. Rats had built nests, and it took us about an hour to clean that whole thing out. And we got rid of them. They are not invited to be in the parade. Don't want them. And the speaker is here. Yes. And I will close and thank you all for allowing me to just tell you how much we enjoy telling you about the Shalako National Alumni Association and all the work that it's doing. In addition to the vets, we tried to honor all those who are older and all those, let's say this year we're going to honor which class? 1968. And they're already really excited about doing a program. One thing that they're going to do and they're excited about is to have an Indian ceremonial for those individuals who have been buried in the school cemetery. So we're going to have that as an addition to what we do. Oh, in ending our Shalako reunion, we always have a worship service on Sunday morning. And you ought to hear some Indian singing. This year, if you happen to visit us at our reunion, you come to worship with us, you'll hear beautiful Indian singing, praising the Lord. And thank you very much. And I turn it back over to you.
Do you ever have a day that's just weird? This is the one. This is the one. I've been ready to go since this morning about 7 o'clock, and we still found something that wasn't quite working right with us. So anyway, I did want to talk to you about Shalako, which happens to be one of my favorite places. When I was working at the Oklahoma Historical Society, among other things that I did was to do National Register nominations. And along about early 2000s, I was asked to go up to Chilocco and visit the school with the potential of writing a National Historic Landmark nomination for it, which is, you know, a way high step above a National Register nomination. So I went up there with the head of the part of the Oklahoma Historical Society that deals with National Register nominations and historic preservation. and one of her other staff members, and we just had a really great time visiting Shalako. It happened to be a day when a lot of the alumni were there, and they were cleaning up around the school, which had been sitting empty for quite a long time. And so it needed to have limbs picked up, and it needed to have leaves raked, and there were just kinds of things that has to be done on a pretty regular basis. So as we were walking along the street by the central oval and the home for one of the girls' dormitories, there was a lady there, and she was sweeping the leaves out of the gutter. So we stopped to talk to her for a minute, and she was a member of the Alumni Association. And she just looked around and she just said, you know, this was home. This is where I grew up. This was home. Later on, the Alumni Association asked Roger Harris and me, Roger was the oral historian at the Oklahoma Historical Society, and they asked us to attend their annual class reunion and to interview some of the Shalako students. Well, we did. I think I did 4 interviews that day. You know, usually you do 1 a day and that's about it. I did 4 that day, and Roger did a bunch too. And so we got a chance to learn more about what it was like to be a student at Shalako, particularly in the 1930s and 40s and 50s. And we had a really good time. So got to know a little bit more about Shalako. And there's a lot to learn. There is a lot to learn about that school and what it has meant to people over the years. So recently I've been working on a manuscript called Oklahomans in the Great War. And I thought it would be a good time maybe to go back and look at Shalako again, because Shalako participated in the Great War. They had a number of young men who were taken into the service or volunteered to serve. And so I thought that that's what I'd talk about today. But as I'm starting here, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about the school that you may or may not know. It was founded in 1884 up in northern Kay County, Oklahoma. It was 8,640 acres. And that was the largest Indian school campus in the United States. Now, why did the government set aside that much land? Well, they set it aside partly because the land was available in the Cherokee Outlet, but also because they wanted it to be an agricultural school, and that would help it to be self-supporting, but it would also be a good place where Indian young men could learn farming methods and prepare themselves for that career later in life. Of course, as times were changing in the late 1800s and into the early 1900s, it became clear that you needed other occupations perhaps as well as farming. And so it also developed as a school where you could learn various trades in preparation for careers that might not have to do with farming, that might be more urban oriented. It was a non-reservation school, unlike so many of the Indian schools that were created on a reservation or near a reservation. This was a non-reservation school in that it was in the Cherokee Outlet, which was not in itself a reservation area. And it was the only school that was designated to be agricultural. That was going to be the emphasis. The original building was called the Prairie Light. It was sitting out there on the prairie. It was about a 3-story building. It was tall. It was imposing. There was nothing else like it. And at night, you could see the lights from that building for a long, long way. So that's why they called it Prairie Light. And that's the name of a very good book about the history of Shalako. It's Chanina Lomawaima's book. They called it Prairie Light, the story of Chilocco Indian School. If you haven't been there, and you're going up Highway 77 towards Kansas, you can pass the entrance to Shalako, and you can see in the picture on the left what the entrance looks like. It's been renovated over the years and changed, but it's still the entrance, and it takes you in on a long road west to the school, and that road is lined with, I believe it's elm trees. I could be mistaken about that. Correct me if I'm wrong on it. But it's still a very impressive entrance, even although a lot of the trees have died and are diseased and perhaps needed to be replaced. But it still is impressive. It takes you in about a mile, mile and a half, something like that, crosses Shalako Lake, and then takes you into the main campus. The campus still today has a number of very impressive buildings that were built in the early 1900s. For example, the one on the left side of the screen is Hayworth Hall, and that was the main offices for the school, but it also included classrooms and a large theater. Then when you get over onto the north side of the campus, you would pass Loop Hall, which was also built in the early 1900s. And it served as a cafeteria, and it also had kitchens where students could learn to be cooks or bakers and prepare that for that kind of profession when they were going to be leaving the school. But when you looked at the great number of buildings that were still standing there in the early 2000s, you see dormitories and classroom buildings, and workshops and gyms and playing fields. The student union was built somewhat later. There was a whole area to the northwest side that was employee homes, farm buildings. It had a filling station and a fire station, which I'm fond of fire stations. My dad was a firefighter for 67 years. But it also had such a substantial structure for that campus that I could understand how the lady that we talked to just looked around and said, well, this was just a city of children. You know, we lived here, it was home, it was a city of children. There were so many of us here, and this became our home. I talked to a gentleman named Buck Cheadle. Overton Cheadle was his real name. He was a member of the Basketball Coaches Hall of Fame in Kansas. Did an interview with him, and he talked about why he and his sister went to Shalako. And he said it was the 1930s, and my mother and father thought about it, and they decided that that would be the best place for us to go, because it was the 1930s, and they knew if we went to school at Shalako, we'd have food, we'd have clothing, we would have an education, and that was what they wanted for us at that particularly hard time. So for a lot of children who went to Shalako, this was not being put in a prison somewhere. It was being sent to some place where they could start to create a future for themselves in a world that was changing for Indian young people. So it was a city of children in a lot of ways, and a lot of young men and women would write about Shalako later and talk about it as just being home. Well, it was a particularly large Indian school, the largest in the United States, and the land base allowed setting aside lands for the production of vegetables and of the orchards, fruit trees, strawberries. It was a good place to raise livestock. One of the things that Shalako boys especially were proud of were the Morgan horses that they raised there. It had its own dairy, and it produced enough food to feed its students and see that everybody on campus was well fed. By 1899, there were students there from 28 different tribes in the United States. And then when the 5 civilized tribes were forced to close their schools in the very early 1900s, a lot of the children from the 5 civilized tribes went to school there as well. One of the most active superintendents was Samuel L. McCowan, who was the superintendent from 1902 to 1908. And he was very active in publicizing Shalako. He saw to it that some of the boys went to the Chicago exhibits in the early 1900s. But he also worked with the agriculture faculty here at Oklahoma A&M. I think maybe it was because even though Oklahoma A&M had some farmland, it didn't have enough for all of its agriculture programs, but they did have the land available at Shalako. That's my guess. I couldn't say that for sure. but there was a long association between Shalako and Oklahoma A&M and Oklahoma State. And one evidence of that is that in 1917, in the research that was going on here at Oklahoma State, they produced an oat cultivar which they named Shalako. So that's kind of a reflection of that long association. Well, when the United States entered the Great War, Shalako was going to be involved. And that meant that students and alumni either volunteered for service or were drafted. Now, Shalako was like a lot of the Indian schools in that there was a military character in part to the school. Wearing uniforms to class every day, doing marches and drills, and just generally military activities was pretty standard at the Indian schools, at least here in Oklahoma and Indian Territory. And so when the war started, you already had a lot of Shalako students and Shalako alumni who were familiar with the military because of the time that they had spent at Shalako. And a number of them either volunteered for the service or they were drafted. There's less information available about what Shalako Girls did during the war, but you do get hints that they wrote a lot of letters to friends who had gone into service, knitted some sweaters, knitted foot warmers, things that they could send over to the boys that were there. But we do know, at least from these pictures I found in the Indian School Journal, that they marched in support of the Third Liberty Loan Drive at Arkansas City, Kansas. So they were active, at least to some extent, in activities in support of the war. There was also an advisor who urged people over 18, girls over 18, to apply for government jobs. Many of them had learned to be typists at Shalako, and typists and stenographers were needed in Washington. And so word came down through the federal Indian system that if Shalako girls want to apply to go and work for the government and they have those skills, then they would be welcome to do that. But most of the information that you find in the Indian School Journal, which was published several times a year, it was a little iffy. One of the activities that young men could participate in was printing. They had their own printing program there, teaching them how to put out a newspaper, how to put out the Indian School Journal, just how to become printers, so they had that option of an occupation when they left the school. And if you get a chance to look at it, I think we have a few volumes of the Indian School Journal here, but I was lucky to find a lot more at the Oklahoma Historical Society, and that was where I was able to gather a lot of my information. So we do know that the war had an immediate impact on the school, and a lot of young men and women decided that they did want to do whatever they could to help with the war effort. And a lot of the young men decided that they would either enlist or that they would be drafted and they would take part in the war. They had that familiarity with the marching and the drilling that they would be learning in the Army, and so they were willing to do that. And we're not going to be quite so awkward as a lot of young men going in who had never had that opportunity before. One of the people that I particularly enjoyed reading about was a young man named John Shawnigo, who was an absentee Shawnee from Oklahoma, and he had learned to be a baker at Shalako. Apparently, he had been out of school for a few years and he was working at that job, but when the war started, he was drafted and he became a quartermaster sergeant first class in the 316th Bakery Company at Camp Funston, Kansas. Now, if that's not a familiar name to you, it was within sight of Fort Riley, Kansas. And I think it was put in there as the war was going on. More and more young men were going to the war and they needed to have some extra space. Let me read you a letter. Whoops. Everything going right today. Okay, here's a letter that John Shalako wrote back to Shalako to tell what was going on in his life at Camp Funston. And this letter was written October 21st, 1917. And he wrote, "Dear Mr. Allen," who was the superintendent at the time, "while off duty, I shall write a few interesting things that are going on here at camp. Camp Funston is located between Manhattan and Junction City, Kansas, on what is known as the Ogden Flats, a few miles east of the Pawnee Flats. It's surrounded by hills and a river, and it looks like a town when one is on the hills overlooking the barracks. Looking west, we see the cavalrymen and the artillerymen going up and coming down the hills in their daily drills and going on hikes. Looking still further to the west, we see the barracks of Fort Riley. They're going through the same drills we're going through here at Funston. Back at camp, we can see boys and men from various parts of the good old USA talking over the things they will do when they cross the real lake, their terminology for the ocean. It's getting colder each day, and some gather in the warm side of the barracks to talk over what they've learned about Army life and wondering if they're going to land safely in France. Back in the bakery, which is where he worked, you'll find the boys of the 316th Bakery Company talking over what kind of bread we should make to help the American Army bring the war to an end. We're now making 18,000 pounds of bread every 24 hours. The details are divided into 2 shifts, 30 men each. There are 4 big ovens used by 2 shifts of bakers. Army regulations require that bread must be from 18 to 24 hours old before it's delivered. Experiments proving that warm or real fresh bread is not good for the soldier. The bread is delivered in large trucks to the company kitchens. We're busy day and night. The bread room is very large. I should judge it will hold 75,000 pounds of bread. When the bread is issued, this room is almost empty. Something like 25 to 30,000 pounds of bread goes out on the trucks each day. All this bread goes to our 40,000 drafted men and the others that are at the camp. In the field bakery, we're taught how to make war bread, as it's called. It was made so it will keep for months. The older it gets, the better it tastes. It will weigh about 4 pounds 4 ounces rounded up with holes punched in it before being proofed. After being baked, it will weigh 4 pounds. The 4 ounces bakes away. Takes about an hour and 55 minutes in the field ovens. Field ovens can be taken down and loaded on wagons in a few minutes, and these ovens can be put together and have a fire in them in less than 45 minutes. The oven is placed over a ditch that's 22 inches at the top, 16 inches at the bottom, and 20 inches deep. Baking in these ovens is being done winter and summer. We're not using these field ovens at present. We don't have enough men to work at both of the bakeries. I've been in charge of 1 unit until we moved into the large shop, and now I'm in charge of 2 large ovens that bake over 200 pounds at a time. I'm now ranked as a first-class quartermaster sergeant. My best regards to you all. John Shalako, 316th Bakery Company. So you've got a Shalako boy who's gone out, joined the Army, and is doing pretty well for himself. And that's his picture there, John Shalako. John Shikag was another soldier who had been at Chilocco, and he found himself in the medical corps. Let me see if I can find his letter here. What I'm trying to give you is just a general sampling of the different kinds of things that these young men and women did as they were moving out of Shalako and into the Army. Okay, he was at the time at Camp Green, North Carolina. He said, "Dear Sir," to Mr. Allen, "I've decided that it would not be a bad idea to write someone there, being an ex-student, and to tell something about what I've done since leaving there. As is the case with all beginners, I had my ups and downs trying to get a start in life as I should, till I finally succeeded to my belief and enjoyed a good home and pleasant surroundings up to the time of my enlistment. I joined the Medical Corps, and I like the life of a soldier and also the work. It's very interesting and helpful as well, and will be a great help to me on my return to civil life after a seal has been put on the Kaiser and his culture. Our work consists of giving first aid, surgical dressings, etc. We're taught how to handle the wounded from gunshot, bayonet, etc., and how to treat them. We have foot and later litter drill and lectures galore. We're assigned to the wards where we help with all this work, and each one is kept in a ward for 2 weeks on a certain disease. Then he is transferred to some other ward, and in this way, they saw that we are better prepared for our work over there. It's since the call to colors that I finally realized what Shalako has done for me. I cannot express my appreciation for the efforts and the patience it took for the teachers there to prepare us and enable us to go out into the world capable of holding our own in everything we undertook to do. I've often thought of those happy days spent at dear old Shalako. You often see that term, dear Shalako or dear old Shalako. At times the duties required of me seemed very difficult, and I got discouraged, but there was always someone to help me out and encourage me to go on, and today I can see where it benefited and helped me. The instruction I received in military discipline certainly was a help to me on my enlistment. I had no trouble mastering the execution of different commands, and glad to say have never appeared in the awkward squad, thanks to Shalako again. And so may the good work that is being done to uplift the Indian race keep on accomplishing greater things for them. So that was what John Shekag had to say about what he was learning there. The picture is of Edward Dominguez in 42nd Division, which you will probably know if you've done much reading about the First World War. And I don't have much information about him, but at least when the picture was made, he was in France. It's interesting that a number of the Shalako boys chose to join the Navy. One of them was Albert Durant, who was serving on the USS Tacoma in November 1918. And he wrote, "I've been doing foreign duty ever since I entered the Navy, and I'm a petty officer now." So he's a young man who has made a place for himself in the Navy, and he's starting up the lower ranks. Another Shalako boy who joined the Navy was David Lavers, who was sent these photos of himself when he was in his uniform and dressed up, and then when he was sitting there like scrubbing his clothes over a bucket, which is something that probably had to be done pretty often too. So we do find a number of Shalako boys that went to the Navy. This young man has one of the more interesting letters that he wrote. This is George Roach, who was trained in wireless telegraphy at the radio school at Harvard University. His war went on and extended into the spring of 1919. And let me read you a little bit from George Roach. Yeah, this is the right one. This was in the October Indian School Journal. He says that I entered Great Lakes as an apprentice seaman after 6 weeks of training, the required time before a transfer can be granted. 6 of us from my company put in an application for the radio school. Now, if you may remember stories from fathers and grandfathers who were in the Navy during World War II, and a lot of them trained at Great Lakes. My dad trained there, and he nearly froze to death. He was absolutely miserable at Great Lakes, although he did enjoy being in the Navy. Okay, so George Roach says, I entered Great Lakes as an apprentice seaman, and after 6 weeks of training, the required time before a transfer can be granted, 6 of us from my company put in an application for radio school. A few days later, we were called in for an examination. After passing the examination, we were told to report back to our company for further orders. This was on Friday, and the following Tuesday, we began the study of wireless telegraphy. 5 weeks from that day, 2 of the 6, including myself, took the examination for Harvard. which had another school of telegraphy, and that was like your step up to get to Harvard. We both passed, but to my regret, the boy failed on the doctor's examination and was sent to an isolation camp for 6 weeks. That left me to make new acquaintances, and up to the present time, I've been unable to find any other Oklahoma boy here. They had a very adventurous trip from Great Lakes to Harvard, but once they got there, he says, while in Harvard, we learned the theory of wireless telegraphy and have a specified time to do it in. We go to school from 9 o'clock to 11:30 in the morning, drill from 1 o'clock to 2:15 in the afternoon, and then go to school until 5 o'clock. A person is required to go to night school from 7 to 9 o'clock 3 times, 1 week and twice the next week, until he's able to receive 22 words a minute. Saturday afternoon is set aside for passing and review or inspection at Harvard Stadium. And Saturday afternoon, the Jackies, which of course was a nickname for sailors in those days, go for a 48-hour leave, providing they've not missed muster during the week. If so, they must stay at home. He very much enjoyed being in radio school. He became a very proficient radio telegraphy operator. I have since learned from other readings that there was another young man named Morris Badoka who was a Caddo, Delaware from southwestern Oklahoma, and he also went to radio school and became very proficient at that job and really enjoyed it. Well, he spent his time in the Navy. So that was yet another career that these young men learned during the war and carried on very successfully during the war. Another young man that I found particularly interesting is ASA Froman, who was a Peoria Indian from northeast Oklahoma, who served in Company E, the 142nd Infantry. His name always rings a bell with me because I believe it was perhaps his grandson or maybe a nephew who was chief of the Peoria tribe at a time when I was regularly attending Indian meetings conducted by the state while I was working in Oklahoma City, and so I knew John Froman, who was the chief at that time. Well, Asa Froman had been very active at Shalako in the YMCA, and he continued that work while he was in training at Camp Bowie. So he took that with him. Now, Camp Bowie was one of the 2 main training camps in Texas where so many Oklahomans went in the course of the war. We have a picture here that I found in the Indian School Journal. These were 5 of the seniors from Shalako who were called up and served in the war. Altogether, there were 131 Shalako boys who were called up for the Great War. Of those, 3 were killed or died. One was Simon Mosley, who died from the Spanish flu, and that was a very serious epidemic that swept across Europe and then swept across the United States later. Bennett Lavers, who was killed in the Argonne Forest, and David Johnson, who was killed on the Mears River a week before the armistice was over. I want to read you a couple more letters because I think this is the best way to get in touch with how the young men from Oklahoma were training and what they were accomplishing when they were in the Army. Charles W. McGillberry was at Camp Travis, Texas, where he trained, and he wrote to Superintendent Allen, "At last I'm able to tell you I am a soldier. I feel humble but mighty proud. Once more I can feel that I'm doing what's expected of every able-bodied young man with love of country burning fervently in his bosom. I have been vaccinated, inoculated with an anti-typhoid serum, and ever since I have been a tender and patient nurse to my ever-aching arm. The pricking of the needle, though it was punched 1.5 inches in my arm, was not so painful, but about an hour later was rather trying. And they tell me I'll have 2 more inoculations in as many weeks. I believe I would rather meet the fiercest onslaught of the fighting Huns instead. The government certainly showed a splendid judgment in selecting this place for a camp. The water is obtained from artesian wells and is very good. The climate's especially favorable for training men in the arts of modern warfare, which will in turn ripen the men into rugged manhood. The general lay of the land is suitable for its purpose. These truths make it an ideal camp. Therefore, it's not surprising that thousands of soldiers are here training in order to make Prussian autocracy come trembling to the knees of democracy. And then he asked, would you please send me copies of the Indian School Journal? That's what I really need to see, what's going on in Shalako. And he concludes, here's hoping that you and Shalako will have a grand success during the year 1918. Please give my tenderest regards to all I know. Charles W. McGillberry. A lot of the letters carry the same theme. They also talk about wanting to give back to the nation because of the benefits that they feel they've received from going to school at Shalako. And so you see that a lot, and it does not seem to jibe with what you often read about of Indian schools in that day. Maybe we're only seeing the letters that came from the young men who felt that they had received major benefits from going to school at Shalako. But there seemed to be a lot of them that had that feeling. And they wanted to write home. They wanted to stay in contact. They wanted to say, I'm sorry I'm missing the Valentine dance this year. I'm sorry I won't be there at Christmas time. I'm sorry I'll miss Thanksgiving. They had very strong ties with the school and what was going on there. And they never really lost that tie, even though they were far away. They were still thinking about the school. Here's a letter from another sailor whose name is Chester. Don't have his last name, but he was at the Navy Yard in Puget Sound, Washington, and he has some interesting things that go along with what was happening in the country at the time. He wrote his sister, I received your letter a few days ago and certainly was glad to hear from you. I only wish you could write oftener. I have 4 letters to answer now. A good many have died here of the influenza. You can hear a volley of shots every once in a while, and we know they've buried somebody with a military funeral. They fire 3 volleys over the grave. One of the boys saw them taking out 17 caskets yesterday. We can't tell when our time is coming. They carried one out of our company today at noon, which I think is the only one so far. I guess we're too mean to get ill. They're very strict during this epidemic. We're not allowed to go to the shows or to public gatherings, and we couldn't if we wanted to, for there aren't any. If you know anyone who's knitting a blue sweater for no one in particular, tell them your sailor brother would appreciate one very much. The mornings here are cool, and it's so foggy we can hardly see ahead of us, and there's a continual scream of boy whistles out on the bay. This leaves me feeling fine. I trust you're enjoying good health. Your brother Chester. I could read you several more letters, but you might be tired of hearing about them from now. So I'll finish up with 2 here that have a particularly interesting bent to them. This one is from Lieutenant J.R. Wheelock, and he was writing to Mr. Blair at the school. And he said, this is in January 1919, because remember the war may have stopped in November 1918, but there was still a wind down period that went on. Dear Mr. Blair, of course you think I've been killed or scared to death. I've been close to both. Nearly got killed, and that scared me almost pale. But I'm here yet, and the war is over, so I guess I'm all right for at least a while. I'm just recovering from an attack of the Spanish influenza. Even that couldn't kill me, so you see, I'm yet to do something for worthwhile before I cash in. This trip's been a wonderful experience for me. Many things have happened that I will never forget. Too bad our friend Mr. Francis couldn't get over. Now, we don't know whether he was an instructor or a fellow student. He was pretty well trained in running, and that would have come in handy for him in running for dugouts when the shells began to come over and the Boche airplanes dropped spitballs all around you. Rank does not count then, but the best sprinter gets in the dugout first. Usually these dugouts have room for 10 or 20 men, but I've seen 40 in a hole where 15 were supposed to go. You bet I wasn't the 40th that got in there either. I tell you, Mr. Blair, This was a place where a man's nerve showed. A fellow that's yellow showed mighty quick when it came to fighting something you couldn't ever see or reach. You could only hear the report of the gun, and 7 seconds later, it either hits you or covers you up with dirt, or shrapnel cuts you in two, or gas. We learned all the various kinds of shells by the report of its explosion, and we also knew the sound of the Boche airplanes. Though they always flew high, we could tell the minute one of them came near our sector. My regiment is in the 1st Army, and we came direct to the Argonne Forest sector in the Verdun front. On the night of September 26, when the Great American Drive started, I was on the 2nd line with the great naval guns, and if hell ever breaks loose, it will not make any more fire noise than they made that night. Since the fighting has stopped, it's mighty lonesome. We miss the ever firing of the big guns. It's like the day following a 4th of July celebration. I hope Shalako is going along in good shape, and that you and your family are well. With kind regards, I'm sincerely Lieutenant J.R. Wheelock. Well, one last letter I'd like to read you here, and this is from George Roach. I showed you his picture a little bit earlier. Here's George. Remember him? Okay. George Roach wrote a letter back to Shalako in May 1919. This was a hurried letter. It wasn't one he could take time to write out carefully. He wrote, "Dear Miss Wallace," which probably was a staff member, "no doubt by the time this hurriedly written letter reaches you, I'll be in combat with the Bolsheviki. We're going to Archangel, Russia, to protect American interest up there and to save the Allies' stores which the Bolsheviki are aiming to get. This barbarous class of people, so I understand, are practically the cause of the standstill in the peace conference, and we're hoping the conference may end soon." Remember who the Bolsheviki are? They're the communists from later on. "We've been in this port, Lisbon, for a week and have put on 2 new 3-pound guns and 5 machine guns, including a gun also for each man on the landing. Some real action is anticipated, but our real job is getting there, for it's 2,800 miles from here, and we have to make it up the river while it's melted, and if we should happen to get caught while up there, well, we'd have a long stay with the Bolsheviki. So we're leaving Brest, France, going to Plymouth, and then on to Inverness, Scotland, from there to Archangel. Volunteers were called for on this expedition, but being a regular Navy man, if I'd not volunteered, I would have been compelled, and rather than be dragged that way, I was willing to respond to Uncle Sam's calling once again, and am wishfully hoping that it will not be necessary for me to show my patriotic spirit anymore until I've seen the soil which I'm representing. Once again, with renewed courage, I'll be more willing to face the troubles of the sea, which are numerous on a small craft." It's not entirely clear, but he may have been on one of the first submarines. Can't say for sure. At least one of the Shalako boys was on a submarine. So he concludes his letter saying, "Today is April Fool. It's night, and it seems as though I can see our dignified party in the gym enjoying themselves in their many different costumes, thinking about Shalako. I'll write at every port and cable in time to reach there by commencement." So that was a type of letters that these young men wrote back to Shalako. And you might think about that and consider what their experience was like during the Great War. In some ways, being at Shalako from the time that they were young boys had helped them develop some of the things they would need to know when they actually were in the military. Routinely, they wore uniforms, they marched to classes, they conducted drills, they understood the terminology, and they understood the activity. So they were not, as one of them said, in the awkward squad when they went in as enlistees. They already knew how to do those things. They also seem to have been accepted as soldiers and sailors on an equal basis with the white draftees. None of the letters complain of any kind of mistreatment or of being pushed aside or anything that says they were set apart because they were Indian soldiers or Indian sailors. This is different from the way the black soldiers and sailors were treated. Almost all of them wound up in non-combat roles when what they wanted to do was fight. They joined the military to fight, and they were very frustrated when they were not allowed to fight. The only black soldiers from the United States that I've been able to track down, and I could be wrong, were the ones that actually were taken into the French units and fought with the French in Europe. So the soldiers and the sailors from Shalako don't seem to have been pushed into that non-combat role. They seem to have been accepted with the other people in the same units. And from the letters that they wrote that were published in the Indian School Journal, they really appreciated what they had got at Shalako, what they had learned, the way it had prepared them for life after Shalako. And they appreciated their teachers, and they also appreciated the ties that they had with their fellow students. So it seems like what these young men reflect in the letters that they wrote is that for them, Shalako had been a positive place. It may not have been perfect, and sometimes times were tough, and situations and conditions may have been bad from time to time, but they seem to have come out of there with a feeling that Shalako was home. And they had a lot of friends, people from other tribes, people from other parts of Oklahoma, from other areas of the United States later on that they might not have had if they had been going to school in some local school in Oklahoma. So that's so far what I've been able to gather from what I've been reading in the Indian School Journal and some of the other letters that I've been able to find, and some of the interviews that we did later, which is a different time period, a much later time period, but you still get a lot of that sense of Shalako being a good place to be. And that flies in the face of a lot of what we were told about Indian schools in the late 1900s and into the early 2000s, when people were criticizing Indian schools so much. So I'm going to conclude there, but I'll be willing to take questions if anybody has any they'd like to ask.